Now think about that for us. When we go to communion, most of you go every week, some of you even every day. Why are we so far away from sanctity? Why are we still guilty of sins of the tongue, of lying, of cheating, of cruelty and sins that are totally opposed to our Lord? It's because when we receive communion, we are not gaining much from it. It's like the old story that the priest told you when you were in catechism class. 2 children go to the river to gather water. One takes a little cup, the other one takes a bucket. And it's the example of children going to communion. One goes with just, a little devotion, and so the amount of grace and merit they receive is like a little cup. Whereas the other one goes with much more fervor, and they receive a bucket full of grace and help from God to advance in sanctity. So that's the same for any of you. When we go to communion, it depends. Obviously, we all receive Christ the Lord. The difference between Imelda and Mary of Egypt and us is our dispositions. St. Pius X famously said, Holy Communion is the surest and fastest way to sanctity. There's no other way that's more easy for us to become a saint than the route of receiving Holy Communion. So, obviously, in the Mass, when you go up to communion, you should be very, very fervent. And I think that's the one thing that will change our parish, is if our parishioners made sure to receive communion very, very devoutly. Because it would change you. It would change each person in your family that follows your example. And gradually our whole parish would be changed for the better. Well, getting back now a little bit more closely related to the prayers of the Mass, the priest, after communion, he comes back to the altar and he puts the Blessed Sacrament away. There's not much for me to say there, except I want to remind you again of how precious the Blessed Sacrament is in the mind of the priest and the mind of the church. That the priest takes the paten that the altar boy was holding and he wipes it with his finger so that every single particle is put back into the chalice. And then, of course, as you know, I think I told you this already, he scrapes the corporal. He actually does that before he gives you communion. But he scrapes the corporal to make sure there's not even one little piece, tiny, tiny piece of the Blessed Sacrament. And again, you compare that to the Novus Ordo. Compare the way they conduct themselves after communion. Obviously, communion in the hand, there's particles constantly being brushed on the floor, on their clothes. They don't think anything of it. But as St. John Chrysostom said, every single particle is like gold dust. That's what St. John Chrysostom said. I'm sorry, St. Cyril of Jerusalem. St. Cyril of Jerusalem said every single particle is to be protected. It's like gold dust. And I remember one time I was in San Antonio, Texas, and I was giving out communion, or it was time for communion, the Mass. It was a Saturday Mass, and I had just flown into San Antonio to say the Mass for their parish for that weekend, and they had a Saturday Mass. And I went out there, of course, celebrated Mass, and then I opened the tabernacle, and there were no hosts. I was like, oh no. The church was full of people. Even though it was a Saturday, it was, I think, a first Saturday, and it was a lot of people to go to communion. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And so I genuflected and turned to the people, and I said, I've just opened the tabernacle, and there's very few hosts. I think there were 7 hosts in the ciborium, and there was like 120 people in church, So I just told him, I'll break the host up into pieces, but I'm sure there won't be enough for everyone. So, I'm sorry, but I'll just do the best I can, because you can't break it, there's a certain point that you can't break the host anymore. You'd be just making crumbs in your hand. But I broke up the host, and I started giving communion, tiny, tiny pieces of Holy Communion. And I told the people too, I said, think of it this way. Perhaps you're making reparation for all the people in the new church who don't care about the crumbs of the Blessed Sacrament. Every particle of the host is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And perhaps by receiving these small particles of the host, you're making reparation for the sins going on, the sacrileges going on in the new church. Well, I started breaking up the hosts, and incredibly enough, I was able to give communion to every single person in that church. Obviously, the pieces they received were just tiny, little tiny squares, no larger than, your fingernail or something. It's just, just tiny pieces. And but I was able to give out communion to everyone, and I had leftover in the ciborium. It was it wasn't a miracle or anything. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying, but it was reminiscent of the multiplication of the loaves. Everyone was able to go to communion, and people came up to me afterwards, and I mean little kids and teenagers, and I had a teenage girl I remember say to me, "Father, it was the most fervent communion I've ever made in my life." And she was just commenting on the fact that because of the fact that she thought maybe I won't get to go to communion. She was one of the last people in line, and she thought I might not be able to go to communion. She just said, I prayed so much that I'd be able to receive our Lord. And I'm sure it was the prayers of all those people who are just, you can imagine you're the 100th person in line. I want to receive. It was like, for them, it was like, oh no, I won't get to receive communion. And I think it really hit them. It made them realize what they had and what we lose, what so many people in the church are losing nowadays because of the way the liturgy is done. That is, we're neglecting the Blessed Sacrament. We're showing irreverence towards it in the new church. So we have, after then the priest comes back to the altar, he takes care of the chalice, he takes care of the ciboriums, he puts them back in the tabernacle, and he receives the ablution. You'll notice that the altar boys come back up and they pour in first wine, and the priest then mixes the wine with the particles, and he drinks it. And then he goes over to the altar boys and he places his fingers are still together like this. He places them over the chalice, and the altar servers again pour wine and water over his fingers and thumbs. This is so that the priest's fingers are purified too, and the chalice has a second purification. So that again, not a single particle is ever lost of the Blessed Sacrament. Remember our Lord when he multiplied the bread and fish and he fed all those thousands of people in the wilderness. He said to his apostles, go gather up the fragments that are left. And they filled 12 baskets of the leftovers. And it's kind of like that. You say, after communion, the priest is making sure every fragment, every particle is taken care of. We don't want to be guilty of any sacrilege of ever losing a single host or a single particle of a single host. Now, in the Mass at this point, the priest says the communion prayer. And this communion prayer, the versicle that the priest says, is symbolic of joy, the joy of the apostles after our Lord's resurrection. So the communion verse is always a song of joy, of gladness. And we're able to take part in this sacred feast with our Lord. It's a little foretaste of heaven, you might say. It's communion time, of this union with our Lord. So don't waste it. Don't lose these moments after Holy Communion.